My boyfriend Oliver and I had taken plenty of road trips together. It's what felt the most right to us. When we were cramped into a car and driving for miles with no one else to talk to, we tended to have conversations and see things that brought us closer together. We always wanted to get an RV so that we could travel full time, but we never had the money for one that we really liked. When we looked on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist, we would find ones that either had a lot of miles on them, needed hundreds of dollars of fixing up, or the seller just not getting back to us no matter how many messages we'd send expressing our interest. But finally, something came up. A 2009 model that had just been upgraded recently for $5,000 that was advertised as the perfect getaway on wheels for a couple who didn't mind not having much personal space. To many other couples, that could have sounded like a nightmare that would break their relationship. But for Oliver and I, it sounded like our manifestations were answered with a bathroom and bed conveniently 10 steps away from us. When we messaged the seller, he responded immediately and said that we could come pick it up with cash in hand. So that's what we did. With an overnight bag packed with summer clothes and 2 blankets for the both of us, $5,000 in cash in the glove box, and more than enough caffeine in our systems to power us through the overnight trip, we set out in our little blue Subaru Legacy. Passing the time there, we talked about what sort of adventures we would take in our new RV that we weren't able to in our current car carrying us to our destination, attempting to dictate where the paper maps we packed were leading us to, and enjoying being in our happy place with each other. On an open road, listening to our long drives playlist, and taking pictures of wildlife, scenery, and whimsical signs that we passed by. By 1 a.m., we were taking a peaceful, cruise-controlled path through a dimly lit country road, halfway to our destination. I was in the driver's seat, while Oliver fed the both of us a sandwich from our limited supply of food that we packed for the trip. While keeping my eyes on the road and both of my hands on the wheel, I attempted to swirl my tongue to catch the pieces of food that were falling from my mouth with Oliver laughing at the display. I attempted to contain my laughter as his spilled out like the pieces of lettuce from my mouth, but we were both interrupted by the sound that no one wants to hear in the middle of nowhere. I was able to pull off to the side of the road, just barely inching our car into the beam of illumination from the street light. The gravel under the tires crunched before I brought the little blue car of ours to a halt. Oliver, not even waiting for the car to stop, swung the door open and hastily walked to the front. The hood opened and the streetlight was dampened with a cloud of dark smoke that erupted from our volcanic motor. Oliver coughed and swiped his hand over his face while my eyes hovered over the dash of the car, particularly attentive to the glowing red icons.
Great.
Oliver huffed. He shook his head and looked at me in the driver's seat, both feeling the frustration of him and the frustration of our wallets on how much this was going to cost us on top of already a good chunk of money sitting in the glove compartment. I opened the door and immediately wrapped my arms around myself, feeling a chill that I was not dressed to overcome. Stepping out of the car, my boots crunched the gravel as I strode over to my far more automotive enthusiast boyfriend. I took in what was around us. We were on a one-way road that had forest on both sides of us, and to the right of the car off in the distance was a ledge that had an even thicker foliage. Judging from how quiet and remote the area was, I could see it being home to plenty of different creatures. Turning my attention back to Oliver, he stood with a solemn expression on his face, looking at our car. "Damage report?" I asked, but I could guess it was pretty bad considering Oliver's face usually never held a frown on it for too long unless it was a pretty serious issue.
I don't know how it happened, but the motor overheated. The best guess is I just need to add more coolant, but we forgot to buy some more, and who knows how far down the next town is.
Oliver and I looked at each other, then the open car, and then back at each other. We both understood the situation. We were two young adults who were out in the middle of the country with no one around, limited food and money, and no cell reception. All the makings of a typical horror film that some higher power was directing that we didn't ask to be cast as the main characters in.
I'm going to walk up to see if I can find the town.
Oliver snapped me out of my deep thoughts, a feeling of intense worry overcoming me in the moment. Without hesitation, I blurted out, "I'm coming with you." Oliver shook his head.
No, I'll come back with someone who has a tow truck. Besides, who knows what animals are out there that could attack.
Was the caffeine affecting his common sense? Did he really think that an animal couldn't attack him too? At least if we were together, we could keep each other safe. I wanted to tell him this and make him aware that this wasn't a good idea, but Oliver had always been the type who would do what he wanted when his mind was set to it. With a shivery, defeated sigh, I exhaled some of my irrational nerves and nodded my head.
Get in the car, lock the doors, and lay down on the back floor with a blanket over you. And no matter what, don't unlock the car except for me, okay?
Oliver held my arms, securing me into listening to him until I nodded my head. While my head said one thing, my eyes said another. They begged him not to go alone. Whether he was intentionally or unintentionally ignoring the timid welling of tears in them, he let me go and stared at me for a moment.
If I don't find anything in a couple of hours, I'll come right back and we'll figure something else out.
Again, I wordlessly nodded with discontented pensiveness. Just as he turned on his heels to walk into the dimly lit fog caressing the road, I walked back to the car. I took the keys out and closed the driver's side door, moving towards the passengers, slid my legs in, and shut the door behind me. After hearing the car lock, I secured the keys in my thin hoodie's pocket and reached for the blanket that we packed in our overnight bag. A tinge of guilt laid over me like the blanket did, regretting not giving the other one to my boyfriend, who was probably already feeling the cold of this early morning walk. As I laid down on the floor of the car, blanket covering my entire body, I drew in a quaky, anxious breath. I could no longer see the white mist expel in front of me, but I continued to shudder from the cold seeping into the car and the concern seeping into my mind. It was surprising to me how I could have even fallen asleep. I must have woken up from my mental alarm clock as I took a moment to remind myself of my situation. I was in my broken down Subaru on the side of the road with Oliver looking for help in the next town over. I took a moment to listen to my surroundings, waiting to see if I woke up to my boyfriend knocking on the car. But after a few moments, I realized it was just, in fact, my mental alarm clock. And speaking of clocks, I had no idea what time it was. I slowly tilted my body to the side so I could reach into my other pocket that had my phone in it to check the time. 3:08 a.m., it brightly informed me. My eyes shielded themselves to the sudden brightness of the screen before I connected the dots. It had been around 2 hours since Oliver had gone to look for help. Did this warrant being scared? It had been a couple of hours now and Oliver had not returned like he said he was going to. My brain, not wanting to encourage lifting my anxiety to the same level as caffeine in my body, told me that he had turned around and was walking back to the car right now, or even was speaking with someone who was going to help us and was on his way with a tow truck right now. And before I had time to steer my thoughts into a more sinister sort, I heard.
Jonah.
Oliver's faraway shout echoed through the fog and pierced my worries along with it. There was not a moment of hesitation before I threw the blanket off of me and attempted to look through the car's foggy window.
Jonah.
I heard again. I could hear my boyfriend's voice, but I couldn't see him. Pulling up the lock of the car's door, I opened the car and looked around. There wasn't an Oliver in sight. So what was I hearing? Ollie! I attempted to call out, my breath reaching out into the open and calm setting. Ollie, where are you? The fog wasn't as thick as it had been when Oliver had left to go find the town, but there was still a fair amount of insecurity where the road started and ended from where I was, now standing in front of our car. Calling out to me again was Oliver, but through the forest area that was set on the ridge above the road across from me.
I hurt my leg coming back. Help.
It took me a moment before I took a step forward, but something stopped me. Maybe it was that common sense that I commented to myself that Oliver was lacking when he left. Or maybe it was what all the scary movies had taught me. But the churning in my gut told me what would keep me alive tonight. If I went into that forest, I wasn't coming out. My body suddenly felt as though a fire was set under me, and I shook with adrenaline, my breath shaking with it. My eyes were wide, almost as if I thought if they were partially closed, I would miss something potentially coming after me. Against every fiber of my being, I stood there in the middle of the deserted road where I could either escape from it if I were smart, or be remembered by a cross on the side of the road if I was dumb. Oliver? I mustered up all my breath to sound like I didn't want to faint from fear. Did you find the cell phone I dropped out the window a few miles back? Whatever bullshit I was spewing, I was sure that it was going to save my cold, hungry ass from whatever this thing was that wanted me to be blinded by worry for my missing partner. And after a few moments of silence, I had my answer.
Yes.
Thank God I left that car door open, because my flight instinct kicked in the moment I heard whatever that was that answered me as my boyfriend, and I tumbled into the back seat with the door closed and locked in record speed. Not that a piece of metal and glass could protect me from whatever that was that wanted to smash my window in and grab me if it wanted to, but I put every ounce of faith in it. I gathered myself up from the heap of nerves and fear that was welling up in my throat and making my heart pound so hard in my chest that I was sure if I wasn't going to die from whatever was trying to lure me out there, I was going to die from a heart attack. Out of this sick and twisted eagerness to know what was trying its best to do me in, I made the bone-chilling mistake of opening my eyes and looking out where I was almost lured. Even through the fog, my eyes adjusted from the rush of instincts that gifted me hyper-awareness. They fixated on the tall and lanky image of my boyfriend. Oliver stood there, staring at me with wide, sunken-in holes for eyes, but instead of them being chocolate-colored, they were white circles that lit up against a darkness that surrounded his pupils. His hair, usually somewhat wispy and blonde, was slicked back with what could only be mud. His clothes were dirty and torn in a few areas, like he had fought for his life to be standing here in this moment. He was hunched over and letting his arms dangle in front of him, like they were dislocated from his body and barely hanging on if it weren't for his sweater. But what really drove the idea home that this thing standing in front of me was not my boyfriend was his wide, toothy grin that stretched to his ears to render any possibility of being human completely false. I wasn't staring at Oliver. I was staring at something pretending to be Oliver. I'm not too sure what happened after I saw him, or rather, what was impersonating him, but I remember feeling numb, all over my body, with no strength to hold myself to consciousness. Before I fell back onto the car floor, I remember watching the thing that could have once been my boyfriend turn itself around and walk slowly into the forest area nearest to the car. Maybe it was my imagination playing sick tricks on with me, but I could have sworn I saw him lift his face off of his body before I blacked out. When I woke up, it was to the sound of something hard knocking gently on my car window. My eyes were strangers to the sun, and they hurt as such. My head was still feeling light, but I adjusted back to reality, and I focused on the sight of a policeman looking in on me. Leaning up, I grabbed hold of the car handle to steady myself and fixated a suspicious stare on him. He was perfectly human looking, which was a relief. When I looked through the window, I noticed more police with their vehicles were parked all over the road that boasted no life to it last night. The change in scenery insisted that maybe it was all the worst nightmare of my life last night. But if it were all just thanks to my horrific imagination running wild, where was Oliver? I pulled the lock on the door up and allowed him to open the door for me.
Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside for me.
He asked me, setting his flashlight into his belt. I assumed he used it to not only peer through what seemed like permanently situated fog, but also to give my window a good tap. It took me a moment before his words processed into what functionality my brain had left in it after last night. My boyfriend, he left last night to find help because our car broke down. I don't know where he is. The once concerned-looking officer now hosted a colorless complexion with a grim look on his face, but it quickly vanished as he said,
Don't worry, ma'am. We'll find him. I want to get you to the police station so we can make sure you're all right after being here all night. My other officers are looking for your boyfriend.
If I weren't so dazed from last night, I would have investigated his shuffling expressions and questioned more. But I was tired. More tired than I'd ever been in who knows how long. Willingly, I stepped out of the car with his hand reaching out to aid me. The officer placed his other hand on my back, ushering me through a sea of cops and towards his car. My steps were slow and wobbly, like a newborn deer trying to stand and walk after its impatient mother. I was taken to the police station where they made sure I was fed and got a decent sleep. After that, when I was a little more stable, they broke the news to me that Oliver was found in the woods, lifeless. They didn't go into much other detail other than he looked like he was attacked by an animal who was hungry enough to attack a human. I suppose that the officers were used to people being overcome by shock when they hear about a loved one no longer living, but they seemed particularly uncomfortable to watch my expression not distort and remain blank. The only thing I can think of is that it's the most tragic thing that's happened to me in my life, and I've blocked myself off from feeling anything for fear of really grasping that the man I love was killed by something. But it wasn't an animal. It's been 3 years now since Oliver was taken from me. I don't drive the blue Subaru Legacy anymore. I didn't get an RV, and I don't plan on getting one. I live in a city that is always busy and full of noise, especially at night. I've finally learned how to fall asleep to the sound of traffic, cars honking, and people arguing. I know that it's typically not what people want to hear when they're trying to fall asleep, but it's better than hearing Oliver's dislocated voice calling me into the forest every night.